That morning in Liberty, the whole town gathered in front of the old courthouse. Dust swirled in the air, sunlight flashing off the windows, and a crowd of men and women stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see who'd claim the land that had been abandoned for years. 12 acres, an old cabin, a dried-up barn. The auctioneer raised his gavel and cleared his throat. The opening bid, 12 cents. The crowd chuckled at first. 12 cents wasn't even worth a loaf of bread back then. But the laughter faded into silence. No hands went up. Not a single rancher, not even the merchants who usually pounced on land. People shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes, as though the ground itself carried a curse. Then, from the back, a rough-looking man raised his hand. Gideon Hale. His clothes were worn, his face leathered from years under the sun. A rancher who had lost more cattle than he could keep. A man with nothing left to gamble except his own stubborn will. 12 cents, he said, voice low but steady. Heads turned. Some folks smirked, others just shook their heads. No one envied him. They pitied him. You could see it in their eyes like he'd just bought himself a coffin instead of a cabin. The gavel came down with a hollow thud. Sold. Now I want you to imagine riding back with Gideon that day. You've just bought 12 acres for the price of a handful of nails. Part of you feels like maybe you've cheated fate, maybe you finally caught a break. But behind you, you can still feel the weight of those stairs, heavy as chains, whispering, "Don't go there. Don't touch that land." I think about that sometimes, how a whole town can know something, yet no one will say a word. Ever had that feeling, like walking into a room where everyone shares a secret and you're the only fool who doesn't know? That was Gideon's ride home. The dirt road wound through sparse woods until he saw it, the cabin gate, half hidden in tall grass. Weathered boards, sagging hinges, a place that looked more like a tomb than a home. But hanging from that gate was something far worse. A body. It was a woman, an Apache. But not just any woman. She was enormous, taller and broader than any man Gideon had ever seen. Her skin streaked with dust and blood, her eyes cracked open, fighting for air that barely came. She wasn't dead, not yet. And right there, Gideon made a choice. He could have turned his horse around, pretended he'd seen nothing, and maybe saved himself a whole lot of grief. But he didn't. He pulled his knife, cut her down, and caught her heavy body as she collapsed like a felled tree. Think about that for a moment. 12 cents had just bought him a cabin, a patch of dirt, and now the life of a woman whose very presence would drag him into a storm far bigger than he could imagine. He carried her inside, laid her on a table, wrapped her wounds with strips of his own shirt. His hands trembled, not from fear of her size, but from the weight of it all. The way fate sometimes corners you when you least expect it. Her name was Nayeli, the granddaughter of White Hawk, a chief whose people had fought tooth and nail to hold on to their land. A woman spoken of in stories at fur trading posts, a warrior in her own right. And here she was, strung up like a warning sign on the gate of a shack worth less than a dime. Now I can't help but wonder, was Gideon saving her, or was she saving him? Because from that moment on, that 12-cent cabin wasn't just a bargain anymore. It was a spark, a line drawn in the dust. And once Gideon crossed it, there was no going back. You ever notice how life works like that? You think you're making some small choice, a cheap cabin, a shortcut home, a conversation you almost didn't have. But then it unravels into something far greater. That's how it was for Gideon Hale. He thought he'd bought himself a place to start over. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm with a woman who would change not just his fate, but the fate of everyone in Liberty. And it all began with 12 cents, a cabin gate, and a rope that should have meant the end, until a rancher with nothing left decided to cut it loose.
When Gideon dragged Nayeli into that cabin, he expected nothing more than 4 walls of dust and rot. Folks in Liberty swore the place had been abandoned 15 years, just another ruin swallowed by weeds. But when he struck a match, The truth flickered back at him. The stove still held cold ashes. The boards weren't rotting, just sealed tight. Someone had been there, not so long ago. And that's when Naeli spoke. Her voice was rough, broken, but steady enough to cut through the silence. She told him the cabin wasn't just a shack. It had belonged to a man named Samuel Hartwell, a name Gideon faintly remembered hearing at a trading post, always whispered, never spoken loud. Hartwell had stumbled on something dangerous, proof that judges and traders had forged land deeds, stealing acres from the Apache and selling them to ranchers and speculators. Tens of thousands of dollars passed under tables while entire families were pushed off their soil. Hartwell tried to expose it, and for that, he paid with his life. His blood bought their silence, but his evidence, Naeli swore, was still hidden inside this cabin. That was why she had been strung up on the gate, not as a simple execution, but as a warning, a message to her people. Stay quiet, or this is what waits for you. I pause when I think about that, because history, our history, has no shortage of men like Hartwell. Folks who dig too deep, who try to hold power accountable and vanish before the truth ever sees daylight. You ever wonder how many stories like his were buried under courthouse floors, never to be read? Gideon listened, silent, his hands still trembling from the weight of what he'd walked into. He hadn't come looking for a fight. He just wanted a piece of land where he could graze his scrawny herd. Yet here he was, caught between a murdered man's secret and a woman who carried the bloodline of a chief. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long through the cracks in the boarded windows. That's when Gideon saw him. Out beyond the tree line, as still as a statue on horseback. A wide-brim hat trimmed with silver caught the last rays of light. He didn't approach, didn't ride off. He just watched. When Gideon's eyes met his, the rider turned, vanishing into the woods. A chill ran down Gideon's spine. The next day, in town, that rider introduced himself. Fletcher Knox. His name carried the kind of weight that made people step aside without a word. He walked into the general store while Gideon was buying medicine for Naeli. No small talk, no wasted breath. Just a leather pouch dropped on the counter, heavy with the clink of silver and gold. $500. Now to put that in perspective, $500 then was enough to buy not one, but several ranches. More money than Gideon had ever held in his life. And Knox offered it with a smile sharp as a knife. Hand the cabin over to me tonight and walk away breathing. Think about the temptation. Gideon had paid 12 cents. He was being offered a fortune. Any practical man would have taken it. Who wouldn't? But Gideon just stood there, calloused hand tight on the strap of his saddlebag. He looked Knox in the eye and asked the question no one else dared. Why pay $500 for a rotting shack? Knox's smile didn't falter. He only leaned closer and said, "Because I'm buying your good sense. That cabin is not for a man who wants to live long." And that's when Gideon knew. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about cattle, or barns, or even the cabin itself. It was about the secret buried beneath those floorboards, the same secret Hartwell had died for. I'll be honest with you. Part of me wonders what I would have done in Gideon's boots. Do you take the money and live quietly, knowing someone else will bury the truth forever? Or do you hold the line, even if it means every gun in the county turns its sights on you? Gideon made his choice. He didn't pocket the gold. He didn't hand over the deed. He walked out of that store with supplies in one hand, a storm in the other, and the whole town holding its breath. That 12-cent cabin had just become a battlefield, and Gideon Hale was standing dead center.
Night fell heavy on the plains, the kind of darkness that presses in until you can almost hear it breathing. Gideon knew something was wrong. He'd been around cattle long enough to sense when a storm was coming, even if this one didn't ride on clouds, but on horses. Out past the tree line, faint glimmers of torchlight began to bob like fireflies. Then came the sound, low at first, then louder, the steady rhythm of hooves. Fletcher Knox had returned, not alone this time, but with the whole pack of guns at his back, men hungry for blood, for coin, and for silence. Inside the cabin, Gideon checked his revolver with hands that didn't shake. Nayeli tightened the grip on her bow, eyes fixed, breath steady. They didn't need words. Both knew this fight wasn't just about surviving the night, it was about refusing to kneel. When the first shots cracked through the air, Gideon and Nayeli met them head-on. The gate, the very same gate where she had once hung like a broken effigy, now became their fortress. Bullets chewed into the wood, sparks from torches rained down, but they stood firm. Gideon's revolver barked again and again, each shot dropping a man who thought the rancher would roll over easy. Nayeli moved like a storm herself, loosing arrows that found their mark, striking fear deeper than lead ever could. The dirt turned dark with blood. That gate, once a symbol of cruelty, was now baptized into something else, a boundary of defiance. But numbers don't lie. Fletcher's gang kept pressing forward, torches hurled, flames licking at the dry boards of the cabin. Within minutes, smoke poured through the roof, the crackle of fire mixing with the thunder of gunfire. Gideon coughed hard, eyes burning, the heat pressing in on every side. For a moment he wondered if this was it, if the story of the 12-cent cabin ended in ash and cinders. And then the earth shook. From the darkness of the hills came a sound older than the town of Liberty itself, war cries rising like the wind before a monsoon. The Apache had arrived, White Hawk himself at the front, painted riders streaming into the firelit chaos like shadows given flesh. Arrows rained down, lances pierced through the lines of Fletcher's men, horses screamed, torches fell, and suddenly the hunters had become the hunted. The battle turned brutal, fast, and close. You could hear steel against steel, the thud of fists and boots in the dirt. Gideon and Nayeli fought shoulder to shoulder with her people, and for the first time that night, the tide shifted. Fletcher's men, so sure they'd ride home rich and easy, began to falter. Some tried to run, but the Apache rode them down like wolves tearing through deer. In the chaos, Gideon caught sight of Fletcher himself, still on horseback, face hard as iron. Their eyes locked across the flames. A silent promise passed between them. This wasn't over. And then Fletcher wheeled his horse and vanished into the night, leaving his men to be cut down where they stood. By dawn, the cabin was a skeleton of charred beams, the smell of smoke and blood thick in the morning air. The ground around the gate was littered with bodies, but the survivors stood tall. Gideon, Nayeli, White Hawk, and his warriors, together, they had held the line. And I'll tell you this, every time I think of that scene, I wonder, how many of us would have had Gideon's grit? Would we have fought for 12 acres and a rotting shack? Or was it never really about the land at all? Maybe that's the thing. Sometimes what looks worthless to the world becomes priceless the moment you're willing to bleed for it. That night, a cabin worth 12 cents turned into a symbol of resistance, and a gate once used for humiliation became a marker of victory. And Liberty, the town that had once pitied Gideon Hale, would never forget the night fire and blood rewrote the story of the 12-cent cabin. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the hills, the cabin was little more than a skeleton, its roof caved, its walls blackened. Ash drifted through the morning air like snow, settling on the blood-soaked dirt. Gideon stood there, shoulders heavy, staring at what 12 cents had bought him, a battlefield, a graveyard, and something more than he could yet name. White Hawk rode in slow, his horse's hooves crunching over the charred ground. He dismounted without a word and walked with Gideon back into what remained of the cabin. The floorboards were scorched, half-burned, but there was a spot Nayeli had pointed out before the fighting, a place Hartwell had marked, hidden beneath planks that didn't quite fit like the rest. Together, they pried it open. And there, buried beneath layers of dirt and ash, was a rusted iron chest, heavy, sealed. Gideon's hands shook when he pulled it up,
maybe from exhaustion, maybe because deep down he already knew what was inside would change everything. The lock snapped with a hammer's blow, the lid groaned open, and inside lay not gold, not weapons, but paper. Stacks of documents, yellowed with age but sharp enough to cut reputations to ribbons. There were deeds, land deeds, pages of them. At first glance they looked official, stamped with seals, signed with flourishes, but the names scrolled at the bottom made Gideon's gut twist. Judge William Crane, Governor Marcus Webb, men who walked Liberty's streets like giants, untouchable, their words treated as law itself. Mixed in were letters, ledgers, receipts, each one tying those names to bribes, to forged transfers, to stolen acres sold off to wealthy ranchers who had built their empires on Apache soil. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't a simple crooked deal or a stolen fence line. This was an empire of lies, a whole system designed to strip a people of their land under the cloak of legality. White Hawk's hands tightened on the papers, his jaw clenched. His people had lived the consequences, families uprooted, hunting grounds fenced, rivers claimed by men who'd never lifted a bucket of water themselves. Now here was the proof. The wound had always been visible, but these documents showed the knife, the hand that held it, and the men who paid to keep it sharp. Gideon's throat go dry. He thought back to Fletcher Knox, the smirk, the $500 dropped on the counter like it was pocket change, the promise that the cabin wasn't for a man who wanted to live long. Now it all made sense. Fletcher wasn't the mastermind. He was just a hired gun, a shadow sent to do someone else's dirty work. The real architects of this hell were Crane and Webb. I can't help but pause here. Because every time I picture that moment, the papers spread across the burned table, the names written in ink, I think about how many times in history the ones wearing the cleanest suits, the ones sitting in the tallest chairs, have been the dirtiest hands in the room. You ever notice that? That it's rarely the man holding the gun who holds the power? More often it's the man writing checks behind a polished desk, convinced no one will ever see through the ink. For Gideon, this was the truth Hartwell had died to protect. And for White Hawk, it was more than truth. It was vindication, proof that the Apache hadn't lost their land to progress or bad luck, but to theft, plain and simple. I remember once reading about ranch wars in the late 1800s, how disputes over just a few acres could spill blood in broad daylight. Now imagine that multiplied by thousands of acres, entire nations of land stolen by men who signed their names with a flourish and called it justice. That's what was sitting in Gideon's hands. And I'll be honest, part of me wonders how heavy that chest must have felt. Not just the iron or the paper, but the weight of knowing the truth. Because once you hold proof like that, you can't pretend anymore. You can't go back to just being a rancher, scratching out a living. Gideon had come to Liberty looking for a chance to start over. Instead, he had unearthed the secret that put him right in the crosshairs of the most powerful men in the territory. And maybe that's the strangest part, how a cabin bought for 12 cents could hold a truth worth killing for. White Hawk looked at Gideon then, not as a rancher, not as an outsider, but as a man standing on the same battlefield. They both knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Because Fletcher Knox was just the messenger. And now, the men who had sent him would come calling. And when they did, they wouldn't be carrying gold. They'd be carrying fire. By the time word spread of what Gideon and White Hawk had unearthed, Liberty was no longer a sleepy town. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came fast. At sunrise, the ground trembled with the march of armed men. They weren't just outlaws this time. They wore the polished boots and brass buttons of soldiers, banners snapping in the wind, rifles gleaming. They came under the orders of Judge William Crane and Governor Marcus Webb themselves. No more shadows, no more hired guns. The men behind the curtain had stepped into the daylight, certain their power alone would crush whatever resistance lingered. The cabin, or what was left of it, was ringed in steel. A booming voice echoed across the smoke-scarred land. "Hand over the woman! Hand over the papers! And maybe, we'll let you walk away." Gideon stepped out first, dust still clinging to his boots, eyes hard as stone. He didn't raise a gun, not yet. Instead, he raised his voice, and the whole valley carried it. "I have the proof. Every stolen acre, every bribe, every signature of yours, it's all here. Your time is up." You could feel the tension snap like a dry branch. Crane sneered from horseback. Webb sat stiff beside him, and in a single wave of his hand, the rifles leveled. And then the battle began. Gunfire cracked through the air, horses screamed, and the earth turned to chaos. But Gideon wasn't alone. Out of the hills, the Apache thundered once more, White Hawk's warriors riding with fury in their eyes. Arrows cut through the smoke, lances broke the soldier lines, and suddenly what Webb had thought would be a quick execution turned into a storm he couldn't control. Gideon fought like a man with nothing left to lose. I imagine his revolver must have felt like an extension of his own will, each shot echoing his defiance. Beside him, Nayeli moved through the fray with the force of a legend. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her people, for every ancestor driven from their land, for every child told they had no future here. The tide shifted. Webb's troops, unused to a battle where the land itself seemed to rise against them, began to falter. One by one they broke ranks, scattering into the dust, leaving behind only their leaders. Crane tried to stand his ground. Sword drawn, spitting fury, he rode toward the gate. But Nayeli was waiting. She pulled him from his horse with a strength that shook the man to his core. They fought in the dirt, his polished boots slipping, her blade flashing. And when it ended, it was Crane's hands bound, his face pressed into the same soil he had once tried to hang as a warning. Governor Webb fled, but not far. With the Apache closing in from every side, even his guards abandoned him. He was dragged back into liberty, not as a ruler, but as a prisoner, his name already poisoned beyond repair. And here's the part that always stays with me. The evidence, the chest of papers, the signatures of Crane and Webb, wasn't burned in secret or buried again. It was carried straight into the courthouse, the very place where those men had once twisted the law to serve themselves. This time, the truth was read aloud, before the townsfolk, before the soldiers, before anyone who had ever whispered that justice was just another word for the powerful. Crane, Webb, and their allies were taken in chains, not quietly, publicly, and the same people who once shook their heads at Gideon for buying a cursed cabin now watched in stunned silence as the lies of liberty unraveled. You know, I often think about how fragile power really is. One day a man sits on a bench or in a governor's chair, convinced he's untouchable. The next, his name is nothing but a curse. All it takes is one secret dragged into the light, one truth that refuses to stay buried. For Gideon and Nayeli, that 12-cent cabin had cost them blood, fire, and everything they had left to give. But in the end, it also gave them something bigger: justice. Not the kind written by corrupt judges, but the kind earned in battle, carved into history by those who refused to bow. And liberty, for the first time in years, had a chance to live up to its name.
They say every town in the West carries a story that lingers long after the dust is settled. For Liberty, that story was a cabin worth 12 cents, a place once feared, now remembered as the heart of a fight for justice. Nayeli became known as the girl who returned from the dead. Folks whispered her name with reverence, half in awe, half in disbelief. To the Apache, she wasn't just a survivor. She was living proof that no rope, no threat, no empire of fear could silence their people forever. And you know, I think there's something powerful about that image. How many of us have felt like the world tried to hang us up as a warning, only for us to break free and come back stronger? As for Gideon, he never asked to be a hero. He was just a poor cowhand, a man who scraped together nickels and sweat to buy a piece of land no one else wanted. But when the moment came, when history pressed its cold barrel against his chest, he didn't flinch. He stood his ground. And because of that, Liberty saw a side of him no one had expected. Not a drifter, not a desperate rancher, but a symbol of what happens when ordinary men decide enough is enough. The cabin itself, burned, rebuilt, scarred, and saved, stood different after it all. No longer a place of fear, no longer the gate where Naeli once hung like a warning. It became something else, a marker of freedom, a reminder that justice doesn't always come from courts or governors, but sometimes from people willing to risk everything for what's right. Imagine walking by it years later, hearing the wood creak in the wind, and knowing that spot had been the line between tyranny and justice. Wouldn't that give you chills? And I keep thinking back to how it all began. One small act. Gideon's knife cutting through a rope. A single decision that, at the time, probably felt like little more than an instinct. Yet that moment sparked everything. The battles, the revelations, the fall of men who thought they were untouchable. Isn't it wild how the smallest choices sometimes shape the greatest destinies? I don't know about you, but that makes me wonder, how many chances do we pass by every day to stand up, to make that cut, to free someone, or even ourselves, from a noose we can't always see? The West has always been painted as a place where gold, guns, and land were the measure of a man. But the story of liberty tells us something else. Real power isn't counted in acres or banknotes. It's not the size of your ranch or the title before your name. It's in your voice when you dare to call out injustice. It's in your hands when you reach out to lift someone instead of looking away. Naeli lived to see her people walk freer than before. Gideon never went back to being just a ranch hand. And that 12-cent cabin, mocked, cursed, nearly forgotten, outlived the men who tried to bury its truth. So maybe that's the lesson here. You don't need a badge or a gavel or a governor's seal to fight for what's right. All it takes is the courage to stand on the side of truth even when the odds are stacked high and the world is watching. Because in the end, the real strength of liberty wasn't its gold mines or its grazing lands. It was the simple, stubborn heartbeat of justice, kept alive by those who refused to let it die. And that, my friends, is a story worth carrying forward.